Have you ever noticed something strange about our world? We have more knowledge than any generation in history, more technology, more comfort, more freedom, and yet something is missing. People are searching, but they don't always know what they're searching for. They scroll, they achieve, they accumulate, they distract themselves. And still, deep down, there's a quiet question that won't go away. Is this really all there is? Now let me take you back, not to the future, but to the ancient world, to a city called Athens. Athens was the intellectual capital of its time, the center of philosophy, the birthplace of great thinkers, a city filled with temples, statues, altars, a god for every need, and a belief for every opinion. And yet, among all those altars, there was one that stood apart, not dedicated to a famous god, not to a powerful deity, not to a name anyone could pronounce. It simply read, to an unknown god. Think about that. The most educated civilization on earth, admitting that there was still something they didn't know. They believed there was a god greater than their knowledge, greater than their systems, greater than their philosophies. But they couldn't define him. They couldn't name him. They couldn't reach him. And then a man arrived, a Jewish rabbi, a former persecutor turned messenger, a man named Paul. He stood in the middle of their culture, not with anger, not with condemnation, but with a revelation. And he said, "What you worship as unknown, this is what I am about to proclaim to you." Here's the question we need to ask today. What if modern America looks more like ancient Athens than we realize? We don't bow to statues anymore, but we still build altars. Altars to success, altars to self, altars to technology, altars to our own version of truth. And deep down, we're still saying the same thing. There must be something more, but I don't know what it is. What if the God you've been searching for, the God you've sensed, the God you've wondered about, has been closer than you think all along? Today, we're going to uncover the mystery of the unknown God and why this ancient message may be one of the most urgent messages for our time. When the Apostle Paul walked through the city of Athens, he wasn't impressed. That might surprise us, because Athens was impressive by every human standard. It was beautiful, intelligent, cultured, advanced. It was the place where ideas were born, philosophy, art, debate, progress. If any city believed it had life figured out, it was Athens. And yet, as Paul walked its streets, Scripture tells us that his spirit was stirred within him, not because the city was ignorant, not because the people were uneducated, but because everywhere he looked, he saw altars. Altars to gods with names, altars to gods with stories, altars to gods with myths and meanings. And then he saw one altar that stopped him. It didn't have a statue, it didn't have an image, it didn't have a name anyone could recognize. It simply read, "To an unknown God." That altar tells us more about the human heart than all the other statues combined, because that altar wasn't built out of rebellion. It was built out of humility. It was an admission, a confession, a quiet acknowledgement that said, as much as we know, we don't know everything. As advanced as we are, something is still missing. Athens had gods for pleasure, gods for power, gods for success, gods for wisdom. And still, they sensed there was someone greater, someone beyond their reach, someone they couldn't define or control. So they built an altar, just in case. And here's what we need to understand. That altar was not a weakness. It was a window into the deepest longing of humanity. Because every generation, no matter how advanced, eventually arrives at the same realization. There is something more than what we can see, something greater than what we can build, something beyond what we can explain. That's why this message is not just ancient history, it's a mirror. Because our world today looks very different from ancient Athens, but the human heart hasn't changed. We don't carve marble statues anymore. We don't burn incense on stone altars, but we still build them. We build altars out of ambition, out of identity, out of technology, out of success, out of self. And just like Athens, we become very good at naming what we worship until we reach the thing we can't name, the sense that success didn't satisfy. That progress didn't heal the emptiness. That freedom didn't bring peace. So modern man does what ancient man did. He creates language for it. He creates systems around it. He creates substitutes for it. But deep down, the confession remains the same. There must be something more, and I don't fully know what it is. That's why Paul didn't mock the altar. He didn't tear it down. He didn't condemn it. He stood beside it, and he said something extraordinary. He said, "What you worship as unknown, this is what I am about to proclaim to you." In other words, Paul was saying, your searching is not accidental. Your longing is not random. Your questions are not a mistake. They are pointing somewhere. And this is where the story turns. Because Paul doesn't present a new philosophy. He doesn't introduce another system of thought. He doesn't add one more God to their collection. Instead, he declares something radical. He says the true God is not like the gods they've been worshiping at all. Not confined, not controllable, not created by human hands. And that's where we're going next. Because the God Paul reveals is not a God who fits inside temples, systems, or categories. He is a God who stands above them all. And once you see that, everything changes. After Paul draws their attention to the altar of the unknown God, he does something unexpected. He begins to redefine God, not by giving him a name first, but by telling them what he is not. Paul says, the God who made the world and everything in it does not live in temples made by human hands. That statement alone would have stopped the conversation, because temples were everything in the ancient world. They were places of power, places of control, places where people believed they could manage their relationship with the divine. If you knew the rituals, if you brought the right offerings, if you followed the system, then the God would respond. That's how religion worked. But Paul says, this God doesn't work like that. He cannot be housed. He cannot be contained. He cannot be managed. And then Paul reaches back into Israel's own history, to a king who built the most magnificent temple the world had ever seen, Solomon. When Solomon dedicated that temple, even he admitted something astonishing. He said, even the highest heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Think about that. The man who built the temple knew God was bigger than the temple. The building was never the point. The system was never the source. The structure was never the solution. It was only meant to point beyond itself. And here's where this becomes deeply personal. Because temples aren't just buildings. Temples are anything we try to use to contain God. They are the places where we feel safe because we think we understand Him there. The places where He fits neatly into our expectations. The places where we don't have to surrender control. For some people, that temple is religion. For others, it's morality. For others, it's tradition. For others, it's ideology. And for many in our time, it's the self. We prefer a God who stays inside our systems. A God who agrees with our values. A God who never challenges our lifestyle. A God who never asks for full surrender. But the true God refuses to be reduced. Paul goes on to say that God is not served by human hands as if He needed anything. In other words, God is not dependent on us. We depend on Him. And that turns everything upside down. Because the moment you realize God doesn't need you, you also realize He cannot be controlled by you. A God you can control is not God. A God you can manipulate is not God. A God who fits perfectly inside your preferences is not God. And that's why idols are so appealing. Idols never confront you. They never call you to change. They never ask you to die to yourself. They exist to serve you. But the living God does the opposite. He doesn't exist to serve our agenda. He calls us into His, and that's unsettling. Because deep down, what we really want is not a bigger God. We want a safer one. One we can keep at a distance. One we can visit, but not belong to. One we can acknowledge, but not obey. And Paul is gently, but firmly, removing that option. He's saying, the God you're searching for cannot be placed inside a temple, a system, or a belief structure of your own making. Which leads us to an uncomfortable truth. If God is not contained by temples, then He is not confined to our categories. If He is not controlled by systems, then He has authority over our lives. And if He is not shaped by human hands, then He is the one shaping us. That realization forces a question. If we didn't create God, and God created us, then what happens when we stop trying to make him in our image? Because once control is removed, something else takes its place. And that something is surrender. And that's exactly where this message is leading next. Because when human control collapses, the truth about who we really worship begins to surface. And that brings us to the next part of the story. There's a subtle shift that happens when we try to bring God down to our level. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't feel rebellious. Most of the time, it feels reasonable, even spiritual. It begins the moment we stop asking, who is God really? And start asking, what kind of God works best for me? Because once we do that, something changes. The God who created us slowly becomes a God we create. And when that happens, God no longer stands at the center, we do. Paul understood this. That's why he was so clear when he said that God is not formed by human hands or human imagination. Because the moment we shape God according to ourselves, we are no longer worshiping him. We are projecting ourselves onto him. Every idol, no matter how sophisticated, carries the same secret. It reflects the one who made it. That was true in the ancient world. People carved gods that looked like them, shared their passions, shared their flaws, shared their desires. And it's still true today. Only now, the idols are more subtle. They don't sit on pedestals. They sit in our thoughts. A God who never disagrees with us. A God who never confronts us. A God who always affirms us. A God who fits neatly inside our opinions. That God is easy to worship because that God never asks us to change. And this is where modern idolatry becomes dangerous because it often disguises itself as freedom. We say things like, I define my own truth. I follow my own path. I decide what's right for me. But underneath all of that language is a quiet reality. If I define truth, then I sit on the throne. If I decide what is right, then I become the authority. And without realizing it, the center of worship shifts, not toward heaven, but toward self. That's why idols don't need to be made of stone. They can be made of ideas, of values, of identity, of personal success, of self-expression. Anything that places me at the center eventually takes God's place. And here's the irony. We think creating our own God gives us control, but it actually traps us. Because now the weight of meaning, purpose, and direction rests entirely on us. We have to define who we are. We have to justify our choices. We have to carry the burden of being our own source. And that burden is too heavy for any human soul. That's why even people who believe in something still feel anxious, still feel restless, still feel empty. Because deep down, the soul knows when it's worshiping a mirror instead of the maker. The truth is simple, but unsettling. If the God you worship never challenges you, never stretches you, never humbles you, then you may not be worshiping God at all. You may be worshiping yourself. And Paul is gently, but firmly dismantling that illusion. He's showing us that the true God does not exist to revolve around us. We exist to revolve around him, which raises a deeper question. If we are not the center, then why do we feel such a powerful pull towards something beyond ourselves? Why does every human culture, no matter how different, reach for meaning? Why do we all sense that there is more? And that brings us to something even more profound. Because the reason we search is not because we are empty by accident. It's because something eternal has been placed within us. And that's where the story takes us next. There's a reason the search never really goes away. A reason success doesn't fully satisfy. A reason pleasure fades. A reason achievement feels incomplete the moment it's reached. The Bible tells us something remarkable, that God has planted eternity in the human heart. Not curiosity, not ambition, eternity. In other words, there is something inside every human being that was never meant to be filled by time or things or experiences. We weren't designed just to survive the moment. We were designed to long for something beyond it. That's why this longing shows up everywhere. In ancient civilizations, building temples to the sky. In philosophers searching for ultimate truth. In artists trying to capture something transcendent. In modern people chasing success, relationships, meaning, identity, different expressions, same ache. You can cross continents, cultures, centuries, and you'll find it every time. The human heart reaching for something it can't quite name. That's not a flaw in us. That's a fingerprint. It's the mark of eternity placed inside a temporal body. And here's the important part. That space was never meant to be filled by substitutes. We try, of course. We fill it with work, with money, with affirmation, with entertainment, with relationships, with causes, with distractions. But no matter how much we pour in, the space remains. Because eternity cannot be filled with what is temporary. And that's why people who have it all can still feel empty. Why people who reach the top still ask, is this it? Why the soul keeps searching even when the mind says it shouldn't. It's not because something is wrong with you. It's because something eternal is calling to you. That's why Paul says God made us so that we would seek him. Even if we have to grope for him in the dark. That image is so honest. Humanity reaching, searching, feeling its way forward. Not because we are foolish, but because we are unfinished. And the tragedy is not that people search. The tragedy is when they stop. When the ache is numbed instead of answered. When the longing is silenced instead of listened to. When eternity is buried under noise. Because that longing is not meant to lead us inward. It's meant to lead us upward and closer. Because Paul doesn't say God placed eternity in our hearts to frustrate us. He says it so that we might find him, which leads to something both comforting and unsettling. If eternity is in your heart, then your life was never meant to be self-contained. You were created for connection, for relationship, for communion with the one who placed it there. And that means something profound. Your existence itself is not an accident. Your breath is not random. Your life is sustained moment by a God who is nearer than you realize. And that brings us to the next truth, because Paul now says something even more astonishing. He tells us that we don't just search for God, we live in him. After speaking about our search for God, Paul says something that would have caught everyone off guard. He tells them, in him we live and move and have our being. And here's what makes that statement so striking. Paul is not speaking to believers. He's not addressing people who've repented or been saved. He's speaking to philosophers, to idol worshipers, to people who don't yet know the God he's proclaiming. And yet he says, you live in him. In other words, your very existence is already sustained by the God you do not yet recognize. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of awareness, it all comes from him. That means something profound. It means God is not distant, not removed, not hiding in the background of the universe. He is closer than we think, closer than our fears, closer than our doubts, closer even than our understanding. If you exist, it is because he is sustaining you. And that applies to everyone. Believer and unbeliever, religious and secular, those who acknowledge him and those who ignore him. Life itself is a gift that flows from God. But here's the distinction Paul is careful to make. Existence is not the same as relationship. You can live in him without living for him. You can be sustained by God without being surrendered to God. You can receive his breath without knowing his heart. And that explains something many people feel but can't quite articulate. Why they sense God's presence in moments of beauty. Why they feel something stirred during silence or wonder. Why they feel drawn towards something greater, yet still feel disconnected because God is near but not yet invited. Paul is describing what theologians would later call common grace, the grace that allows life to exist at all. But grace does not stop at sustaining us. It calls us. It invites us. It waits for response. And here's where it becomes personal. If every moment of your life is already held by God, then he is not asking you to find him from a distance. He is asking you to turn toward him. You don't have to climb your way to heaven. You don't have to reach across galaxies. You don't have to earn his attention. You are already standing in his presence. The question is not whether God is near. The question is whether we are willing to acknowledge him. Because once you realize your life is already held by God, another truth follows naturally. If he sustains us, then we belong to him. And that's exactly where Paul goes next. Because he now begins to speak not just about where we live, but about who we are. And that brings us to a statement that sounds shocking at first, but carries deep meaning when understood correctly. Paul says, we are his offspring. After telling them that they live in God, Paul says something that sounds almost shocking. He looks at these pagan philosophers, men who worship idols, men who do not know the God of Israel, and he says, "For we are indeed his offspring." If we heard that line without context, we might misunderstand it. Because Paul is not saying that everyone is automatically saved. He's not saying that everyone has a personal relationship with God. He's not redefining salvation. What he's doing is something far more precise and far more profound. He's speaking about origin, not redemption, about creation, not rebirth. In Scripture, Adam is called a son of God, not because he was redeemed, but because he was created in God's image. And that's what Paul is pointing to here. Every human being carries the imprint of their Creator. Every life reflects something of the one who made it. Every person bears the image, even if they don't yet bear the relationship. That's why Paul can say this to people who don't yet believe. He's saying, you belong to God in the sense that you came from him, which means something important. Human life has intrinsic value, not because of ability, not because of achievement, not because of status or culture or belief, but because every person is made in the image of God. That truth stands against every form of racism, every form of dehumanization, every system that assigns worth based on usefulness or power. But Paul doesn't stop there, because being made in God's image is not the same as being brought into God's family. Image is given at creation. Adoption comes through transformation. You can resemble a father without knowing him. You can carry his features without sharing his heart. You can reflect his image without living in his house. And that's the tension Paul is holding. Humanity bears God's image, but humanity is also estranged from God. That's why the world feels both familiar and fractured. Why beauty and brokenness exist side by side. Why people can do great good and yet still feel lost. We are his offspring by creation, but not yet his children by rebirth. And Paul's brilliance shows up here, because to reach these people, he doesn't quote Moses first. He quotes one of their own poets. He meets them where they are, without staying where they are. He builds a bridge, not to compromise the truth, but to carry them across to it. And that teaches us something vital. Truth does not need hostility to be powerful. Light does not need anger to shine. And the goal of the gospel is not to win arguments. It's to awaken hearts. Paul is leading them somewhere, from image to relationship, from creation to redemption. And now, with everything he said, the contrast becomes unmistakable. Every system of belief humanity has ever created is about reaching upward. But what Paul is about to reveal next turns everything upside down, because the gospel is not about humanity climbing to God. It's about God coming down to humanity. When you step back and look at human history, a pattern begins to emerge. Every culture, every civilization, every belief system, they all share one thing in common. They are reaching upward. Humanity has always been trying to climb its way to God. Different religions express it differently, but the direction is the same. If I do enough good, maybe I'll reach him. If I follow the rules closely enough, maybe I'll please him. If I gain enough wisdom, insight, or discipline, maybe I'll transcend this world. It's a ladder, rung by rung, effort by effort, achievement by achievement. That's religion. And Paul understands this instinct deeply, because it's universal. It's built into the human response to that sense of eternity we talked about earlier. We feel the distance, so we try to cross it. But then Paul introduces something radically different. He doesn't offer them a better ladder. He doesn't refine the climb. He doesn't give them a new technique for reaching heaven. He declares a gospel that moves in the opposite direction. Not man reaching up to God, but God coming down to man. This is where Christianity separates itself from every other system. Religion says, do. The gospel says, done. Religion says, try harder. The gospel says, surrender. Religion places the burden on humanity to ascend. The gospel reveals a God who descends. That's why the unknown God doesn't remain unknown. He steps into history. He steps into flesh. He steps into our brokenness. And suddenly, the distance collapses. Because if salvation depended on our ability to reach God, none of us would make it. The ladder is too tall. The gap is too wide. The weight of perfection is too heavy. But the gospel says God knew that. So he came to us. Not when we had it together. Not when we earned it. not when we ourselves worthy. He came while we were searching, while we were broken, while we were still reaching in the dark. And this is why grace feels offensive to the human ego, because it removes our ability to boast. It takes away our control. It humbles our pride. We want to contribute something. We want to say we helped earn it. We want to believe we climbed at least part of the way, but grace says, no, you didn't climb. You were found. And that's what makes the gospel so unsettling and so beautiful. It tells us that the unknown God is not impressed by our ladders, but moved by our need. And yet, even knowing this, humanity keeps returning to the same pattern, because reaching up feels empowering. Depending feels vulnerable. And that's why when people turn away from God, they don't stop worshiping. They just change what they worship. They replace the ladder to heaven with the works of their own hands. And that brings us to where this message becomes uncomfortably modern, because the idols of our time don't look like statues. They look like progress. They look like innovation. They look like technology. And that's where the story leads next. When Paul spoke about idols in Athens, everyone knew exactly what he meant. They could point to them. They could name them. They could see the stone and the marble with their own eyes. But idols have a way of changing their shape without changing their nature. They evolve with the culture. In the ancient world, idols were carved from stone. Today, they're engineered from silicon. And here's the sobering truth. Idolatry doesn't disappear when a society becomes advanced. It just becomes more sophisticated. Paul warned that when people turn away from the living God, they eventually end up serving the works of their own hands. That's not just ancient theology. That's a pattern of history. When humanity rejects the Creator, it begins to bow to its creations. And that's exactly where we are. Technology itself isn't evil. Innovation isn't the problem. Progress isn't the enemy. But when what we create begins to shape us, define us, control us, it crosses a line. We once used tools to serve human life. Now human life is increasingly shaped to serve the tools. We check our phones before we check our souls. We trust algorithms more than wisdom. We turn to screens for comfort, identity, and direction. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, we begin to resemble what we worship. Scripture warns us of this. Those who worship idols become like them. And look around. As our machines become more intelligent, people are becoming less attentive. As technology becomes more human-like, human beings are becoming more mechanical. We communicate constantly, yet struggle to connect. We're informed, yet increasingly empty. This is not an accident. When a culture hands its devotion to what it builds, it eventually hands over its soul. And what makes this moment unique is not just the presence of technology, it's the role it's beginning to play. We don't just use it, we rely on it, we listen to it, we let it shape how we see the world and ourselves. And here's the danger Paul was warning about. Long before silicon existed, anything that replaces God as the source of meaning, guidance, or trust will eventually demand allegiance, not because it's evil by design, but because it was never meant to carry that weight. Technology makes a terrible God. It has no mercy, no wisdom, no soul. And yet, when people lose sight of the living God, they don't stop worshiping. They just bow lower to what they can see. And that brings us back to the altar, because just like ancient Athens, we've built a world filled with impressive creations, but still sense there is something missing, something no device can provide, something no system can solve, something no innovation can replace. And Paul's message presses in one final time. Because the God humanity keeps trying to replace is the very God who has already revealed himself. The unknown God does not remain unknown. And that brings us to the turning point of the story. Paul doesn't leave them standing at the altar. He doesn't end with philosophy. He doesn't stop at cultural observation. He doesn't let the conversation remain abstract. Because curiosity is not enough. So Paul brings everything he said to a single, unmistakable point. He tells them that the God they've been searching for, the God they sensed but couldn't name, the God they built an altar for but never knew, has revealed himself. Not as an idea, not as a force, not as a concept, but as a person. Paul says that God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice. by a man he has appointed. And then he gives them the proof. He says God raised him from the dead. That's where the message sharpens. Because the unknown God is no longer distant, no longer undefined, no longer hidden behind mystery. He steps into history, into flesh, into time. The God beyond temples enters a body. The God beyond systems enters suffering. The God beyond human control submits to the cross, and then does what no idol has ever done. He rises. That's the difference. Idols stay where you place them. They decay. They crumble. They remain silent. But the living God steps out of the grave. And in that moment, everything changes. Because resurrection means God is not just real. He is present. Not just powerful, but personal. Not just creator, but redeemer. Paul knows this is where some will hesitate. Scripture tells us that when he mentioned the resurrection, some mocked. Some dismissed it. Some said, "We'll hear you again another time." And that reaction hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. Some people are comfortable with an unknown God, a distant God, a vague spirituality. But a risen Savior demands a response. Because resurrection doesn't just reveal who God is. It reveals who we are. It confronts us with the truth that life has direction, that history has meaning, that our choices matter. The unknown God becomes known, and suddenly neutrality disappears. Paul doesn't force them. He doesn't pressure them. He simply presents the truth and lets it stand. The altar that once represented uncertainty now points to clarity. The search that once wandered in the dark now has a name, a face, a voice. And that's where this message leaves us today. Because the question is no longer whether God exists. The question is whether the God who revealed himself will remain unknown to you. And that's the question every heart must answer. Not someday, not theoretically, but personally. And that brings us to the moment of decision.